Guys, I can't believe I'm sat here saying that I haven't shot a podcast on commercial property in 450 odd episodes of the Dentist to Invest podcast. Yet here we are, and I think it's about time that we righted that wrong. And that's why I'm joined today by a commercial property expert, Mr. Alasdair Irvine. We're here to talk about commercial property, when it makes sense, the pros and cons, and when it doesn't make sense as an investment opportunity, what's hot in 2026 and beyond. This is going to be a meaty episode as ever, so I'm certainly looking forward to it. Alasdair, welcome to Dentist to Invest podcast. Very excited about this episode, commercial property, because we've never done this, and that's been in part because I've never actually really found somebody who is, how can I say this, as qualified to speak on it, I guess, really, as yourself. So what this conversation today is going to be, it's going to be very high level. We're not going to really get into the technicalities and specifics of it. It's really just allowing everybody to understand when it can make sense, so we can pull that out of the ethereal, pull that out of the abstract, and allow people to make decisions from a place of clarity. And on that note, Alasdair, maybe it might be nice for you to do a little bit of an intro to the audience today.
Thanks, James. Yeah, so guys, I'm Alasdair Irvine. I'm a chartered surveyor, and I've been involved in property since 1990, and on the property owning side since 2002. So have been through the good and the bad of commercial property over that piece throughout the UK. Hopefully I can add something today to help you out on your quest.
Yeah, I'm sure you'll be more than able to do that. Looking forward to this. So yeah, let me see here, Alasdair. So I think a good place to begin would be to dissect property in general as an investment opportunity versus other assets like stocks, like bonds, like your traditional ISA, your traditional pension, everything along those lines. So we're discussing it as an asset from a high level, and then we can get into residential versus commercial, because that's a little bit of an old chestnut really in property developers, I believe, property investors rather, I believe. At least it appears that way from the outside looking in, but you might have something to say on that. So let's talk about property first. Why are you a believer in property as an investment asset versus other assets?
So let's say it's not you should be in commercial property alone. It should be part of your portfolio. So if you're looking at cash that you're looking to invest, you should be looking at probably three different pots, as you've mentioned there, James, and one of those should be commercial property. Should you go and see a financial advisor, most financial advisors won't put you down the route of commercial property. Yeah, and they won't put you down the route of commercial properties because they don't make a fee from it, which is the completely wrong way to look at how best to advise somebody to invest their cash of money. You're obviously not in that same camp, James, I understand.
Yeah, that's correct. I mean, I think it's just about weighing up every asset and making a decision on it. And you know what? I mean, on that note, I'm probably quite far along that scale because I'm actually pro crypto. Whenever somebody uses that in the right way in their portfolio and doesn't do anything too ridiculously out there or invest in anything too outlandish in that space, obviously with small measured amounts of capital. But you can, all these things have a place. It's just about knowing how to do it. And as you say, you know, financial planners really do have their place. They can do really, really, really well from somebody, especially from a planning perspective. But you just have to weigh up to yourself, what is this person incentivized to get me to invest in? And does that align with my goals and objectives? And the more you can educate yourself, well, the better you can make those decisions. Although having said that, it's really interestingly, the more avant-garde financial advisors out there nowadays actually have things set up that they're no more incentivized to get you to invest in stocks and bonds versus other assets. That's usually because they go in the total value of the portfolio, not just your AUM. Although it's quite hard to find those, they do exist. For example, shameless plug, but we do actually do that at Alasdair Financial Planning, where it's not your AUM, it's the whole entire value of your portfolio, so there's no clash of interest there. But yes, you are quite right, Alasdair. The vast majority of the time, they're not incentivized. They're incentivized to get you purely in stocks and bonds, which are not always the best asset for you. So yeah, circling back to what we were saying a second ago, what's your mindset? What's your philosophy whenever it comes to investing in property? What do you see as the pros or the advantages versus other asset classes?
The commercial property should give you safe return on your cash. It should give you capital appreciation over the period. And it's really a question of how long you want to stay in through that journey. If you're just in for a year, you're probably not going to get much capital appreciation. You will get a good return, and your good return should be anywhere in the 7 to 10% on your money. But as long as you're using this as properly strategized, it's a good place for your money to be for the longer term. The con, as opposed, is probably it's not as liquid as going into the stocks and shares. But if this makes up part of your portfolio, it's a very good return.
And you know what? One thing I'd like to jump on, which we were talking about before we came on this podcast, Alistair, was that figure you quoted by way of return. What is that composed of? Because everybody knows, and I'll go to the example of stocks. I say everybody, but to be fair, a lot of people are maybe not necessarily aware of this. The S&P 500 is quoted as being able to return 10% year on year on average ish. I think it's like 9.8 if you go back to the 1950s, whenever it was founded or first created. Having said that, in more recent years, it's maybe been like 11-12%, something along those lines. What people don't actually understand is that 11-12%, whichever figure you choose, is actually composed of two figures. First being the actual appreciation of the stock itself, as in how much does the value of the stock grow, and the second being the dividend yield on the stock. So the total return is like 10%, of which usually 4%-ish is going to be capital appreciation, and maybe 6% will be the dividend. Actually, sorry, I beg your pardon, I've just misquoted myself there. Usually it's the other way around: 6% capital appreciation, 4% dividend, something along those lines. It averages out as. That's the real. That's the true facts right there. So that figure that you talked about for commercial property, the 7 to 10% return year on year, I believe that is purely the rental yield, and then the capital appreciation of the property comes on top of that whenever you crystallize the asset, i.e. sell it.
Yeah, so you're entirely right there. It is based, that 7 to 10% is totally based on the rent you will retrieve during the course of a year. And the principal reason for that is because of the nature of commercial property and the leases within them. Generally, you won't see a rental increase any more than every 3 years or every 5 years. And that's what really is creating your capital appreciation. If you look at it in your stocks and shares that you're talking about there, James, you're seeing the shares traded on a daily basis, which brings the value up and down. Your property value isn't really going to go up and down any great amount unless there is complete market change. A war in Iraq, for example, that's not very good for some property. That very quickly brings the value down. But it's generally going to be led by the rental and the growth of rental. So the more you grow the rent, the more you'll see the capital growing. So if we're looking at a blended to compare with stocks and shares over a 5 year period, you should be looking at probably something in the order of early teens year on year once you brought the capital appreciation in at the end of it.
Although, correct me if I'm wrong on this, but that 7 to 10% figure is not necessarily net of the repayments that you will have on your debt, correct? So that assumes that we buy the property outright. Is that fair to say?
So yes and no. So if
Ah,
you've
that I
got so
asked.
so if you've got no debt, let's make it nice and easy. We'll buy something for £100,000. We get £8,000 a year, no debt, 8% return. Dead easy. With your £100,000, however, you could comfortably get debt of another £100,000 to give you £200 property. You're now getting 16 grand return. So by bringing debt in, you actually increase your return. The cash in your hand is different because remember that 16 grand's on your 100,000. Try not to confuse it because that's your equity in. Because you will be paying interest out on the £100 that you have loaned, but your actual return will increase on your equity because your 16,000 at that point is on your 100,000 equity.
So, in other words, in the first example where you have zero debt, you're making 8 grand profit, but that's because you're making 8 grand rental income a year. I should be careful with my words. But in the second example, you've borrowed the extra £100,000. Your profit, your net income yield drops to half, but your profit is still exactly the same if you think about it.
More or less, your £100, and I was confused. I was saying 100,000. Let's go back to the hundreds because it makes it easy. Your £100 will probably cost you 6% a year to borrow. So that's 6,000. So if you're getting your 16,000 rent, take off your 6,000, you're now 10,000 return, where we were 8,000 before with no debt.
Nice. Even though your net rental yield drops, you're still making more money in
Correct.
essence.
Yes. Yeah.
Wow, what a well, it's true. It's just never thought of it like that. Okay. Wow, fascinating.
And
Right, well,
that's your £10 return on your £100 equity. So you're now up at 10% without any capital appreciation.
right. Okay. Yes, I see. I never thought of it like that. There we go. This is why we have experts like yourself for the podcast, right? Because the answer is elucidated like that, and it makes complete sense. I just never really thought about it before. But okay, yeah, fair enough. Great stuff. Great dialogue so far. Great information. Let's move on to what we also said we talked about at the start of the podcast, Alasdair, which was residential versus commercial. What's your thoughts on that? I guess there's a little bit of a clue by the sheer fact that you focus on commercial property in your investment strategies and via what you help people with. But why, in your opinion, does that make a better investment thesis versus your traditional residential properties and buy to lets?
As you said there, yeah, commercial is what I know best, and that's what we have focused on. But probably the reason we focus on it is because the return is actually better. So what you have, where the big difference is, so if I let you a flat, and we'll use the same figures that we're using before, £100 I've bought it for, and I'm letting it to you at £9 a year. I'm getting £9 back, which is better than the 10 and 8 we had before. But as a residential tenant, you can ask me as the landlord to do lots of things. Your boiler breaks, I've got to fix it. If the property's let with furniture, the furniture breaks through wear and tear, I've got to fix it. If your roof starts leaking, I've got to fix it. So actually, there is a cost to running that, and your return of your £9 generally will reduce to £5. In the commercial world, you're letting the property generally on a full repairing and insuring lease. So what that means is the tenant is responsible for not only paying the rent, but the upkeep of the property. So if the roof's now leaking, it's your responsibility to fix. If your heating stops working, it's your responsibility to fix. So I'm not getting my return eroded because there are issues with the property, which is a big difference from the residential world. And a lot of people forget when they look at the residential, they see a great return, but they're forgetting there's a cost to running that, which doesn't exist in commercial. So the return actually isn't as good in residential as it is in commercial.
Fascinating. Fascinating. Okay, and I guess the skill set to invest in commercial is probably a little bit rarer as well, which means that there's less competition. Would you is that fair to say or no?
Wouldn't say there's less competition. There's less in terms of people coming into the market to look at it. There's probably less competition because the entry price in commercial is probably generally higher than you have in the residential. You can get into residential
Sure.
for under £100,000, and it doesn't really matter whether it's £100,000 or a million. You're still letting it to an individual. In commercial property, if you're £100,000, you are probably letting it to an individual, but it's a fairly poor individual, and actually the lease is almost irrelevant because they probably don't have the funds to do the repair as we talked about earlier. But once you get up to probably £250,000 above, it's a quality tenant you're probably getting who is going to give you the return and the security that you're not getting out your £1 million flat.
Right, understood. So there's a little bit more of a barrier to entry by way of finances, financial by
Yes,
way of financially. Uh, is it also fair to say, and I know you have mentioned this already, but just to kind of really stipulate this, that as a general rule of thumb, that you get less hassle out of the tenants in commercial versus residential,
yes,
or
very
is it
definitely. There's no doubt about that whatsoever. I currently look after 140 different properties with 555 different tenants, three of which are residential, and they're the biggest pain in the ass out of our portfolio, which is 150 million of property.
there we go. Okay, cool. So that is worth remembering as well because I know the number of friends who I have who are in property, and if you call it they take exception to you whenever you refer to it as passive income, because they see that as somehow diminishing the level of effort they put in just to keep everybody flipping happy by the way of their residential tenants. So I think that they are probably experiencing that exact phenomenon that you're referring to there.
Yeah, if you go into commercial property, you buy a unit let to Marks and Spencers for 10 years. Pretty much all you'll do in 10 years is send four rental invoices a year because the rest will take
Absolutely.
care of itself.
Which is where you want to be, because they're businesses, right? And there's so much more they have to think about. Well, they have more money as a general rule of thumb as well, of course, because they are a company, and well, they're leveraged obviously. But then as well as that, they have to think about the profit. They want to preserve their business, so therefore they're more likely to pay you. They're not just going to jump ship and move on to the next house, I suppose.
But we
They're
can't
not more
because
locked in as
they're
well.
tied into a longer lease as well.
Yeah.
Because they'll be tied into a 10-year lease, so they can't leave for that period. But they also, as you said there, they don't want their shop to look rubbish. Because if their shop looks rubbish, poor quality, then the customers aren't going to come into the shop. So it's to their benefit to maintain the look and the benefit and the quality of the actual retail outlet. So if you've got a residential tenant, they don't care how it looks or how they leave it.
Yes, true, indeed. Yes, that's what I was getting at there effectively, and you've articulated it very nicely. Okay, smashing. So we've dealt with property as an asset class. We've dealt with specifically commercial property as a type of investment within the asset class of property. Let's get into a little bit more of the nuance of commercial property itself, the different caliber of tenants, what might drive a higher rental yield versus a lower one, what might drive a higher capital appreciation rate versus a lower one. This is some really meaty stuff that we were talking about just before the podcast started, and I remember you saying that a lot of it comes down to what the risk appetite of the investor is. Is that fair to say?
Yes, because you can find a 25-year lease to Tesco. Yeah, and you'll only get probably a 5.5% return on that because it's super safe. It's the same as buying a government bond at that point. You can also get a 25-year lease on a very risky asset, but that will probably give you high teens into 20s return because of the risk that's associated with that particular tenant. They may be about to disappear tomorrow, but there's a massive return, and therefore that's why people would take it on. It's also a lot down to probably sentiment in the commercial property market. So we all know, and we read about it all the time, about how retail's dying on its feet, and there's nothing left because everybody shops online, which is not quite true, and I'll come back to that in a minute. But what it does do is it turns a lot of investors away from retail. So shopping centres today throughout the UK, you will probably get somewhere between a 16 and 17% return on owning a shopping centre. That's not because the rents have stagnated or going down. It's because there's very few banks will fund that at the moment. Therefore, there's less of people going in, less competition, better return, which wasn't the case 10, 15 years ago. Retail has not disappeared and retail has not gone online. I think the figures, and I might be slightly wrong at the moment, but I think it's something like 28 to 29% of retail spend is online, which seems like a lot. I'm much older than you, James, and as a teenager, I did the majority of my shopping in catalogue shopping, which was in its day the internet of the day, and that was mostly clothes. And at that point, that had 18 to 19% of retail spend. So
So it's not terribly more
in the
nowadays.
last 35 years, we've only lost 10% of retail spend. And 35 years ago, you didn't book your holidays online, you didn't buy your glasses online, you didn't buy your insurance online. So the retail spend as we understand it today hasn't changed that much. And what has been a bigger effect that nobody thinks about is you can go to Tesco tomorrow, buy everything you will ever need because you can buy your television there, you can buy your clothes there, you can get your travel money, you can get your insurance, and you can get your food. So that just sucks retail spend out the high street. which people forget about. They just all say it's online, which is not. So retail's still here, and it's from my perspective, it's still very safe. What you've got to do is make sure you invest in the right areas. It's almost Kirsty Allsop, location, location, location. That's so prevalent today.
Fascinating. And there was also something that you said as well earlier, which made me smile. And you said that when you were assessing a client and their risk capacity and what they wanted, which it sounds like that's an integral part of your decision making process, that you might suggest to a client who wanted to play it a little bit more safe to go with a property which has someone like Greg's as a tenant or something like that, because they're a big established company and they seem to be doing all right for themselves, and Greg's isn't going anywhere anytime soon. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, Greg's a phenomenal retailer. They're probably one of my favourite retailers in that they continually evolve. If you go back 20 years ago, you could get sausage rolls and pies. Now you can go into Greg's and you can get coffees, pastries, expensive, various things, trying to compete with the competition. But yes, probably the first thing we do with a new client is sit down with them and assess their level of risk. What do they want back from their property? Which should be the same as anybody sitting down looking at how we're going to invest your pot of cash. And if they want nice, safe, super safe return, then yes, we're heading more towards the better known names. So you mentioned Greg's there, a bookmaker, a convenience store, household names. You will be in the sort of 5 to 8% return there. But if you're prepared to be a wee bit more risky, then we can take you out from there and you're looking at maybe slightly lesser known names, or in up and coming areas where you're maybe seeing the appreciation coming through, but you're getting your return on that because you're into the teens. So you're being compensated for taking that risk.
There we go. There was one other thing I wanted to just touch upon too, which is the other side of your return effectively in property. And that is not just the rental yield, which we focused on just a second ago, which is seems to be mainly or largely down to the level of risk of the client and how liable they are to flake or not pay their rent, basically. The other side of things is capital appreciation, and you said that you've noticed that within certain sectors, you were saying to me off camera that you noticed within certain sectors that the capital appreciation is that much more than others. Can you give us a little bit of insight into that? Which sectors?
Property market and the sectors is probably quite cyclical. So since COVID, 2020-21, the hottest area in commercial property is industrial. And industrial, and it's all driven by Amazon. So Amazon occupy about 90% of industrial space in the UK, either directly or indirectly. So, which is huge. So that goes all the way from the massive distribution shed. So Amazon bring everything in from China, let's say. It goes into the biggest warehouse in the world in London. But how does London serve Aberdeen or Glasgow or Newcastle or Manchester? Well, they need a series of warehouses to get there. So they go from their massive warehouse in London to their slightly bigger one in Manchester to their slightly smaller one in Glasgow. And then from Glasgow, the smaller one goes all the way down to your man who delivers the parcel to your door, who needs his bigger than a garage. So it goes from hundreds of thousands of square feet down to 1,000 square feet. But that whole drive has come on through there, and rents in the industrial market have doubled and tripled over the last 4 to 5 years, which is phenomenal. It's the only sector in the market that has done that. Retail is fairly stagnant over the piece. If you're looking in London, go to Oxford Street, yeah, that has grown. But if you go to the suburbs, it's probably not grown to the same level. And offices have gone up and down as demand has changed over the period. So again, we go back to COVID 2020, 2021. Nobody wanted to work in an office. We'll never have offices again. Well, that of course wasn't the case, but the demand dropped and therefore the rents dropped. The rents are going back up again now. And what we're finding is that office occupiers, if they were in 10,000 square feet in 2020, they're now in 7,000 square feet. So they've reduced their count because of hybrid working and the like, but they've also improved the quality of their offices to get their staff in, and that's driven rents up because the quality of the office space is improved. So if you were buying today, and it's all down to the lump sum you're going with in the first instance. But if you're buying today, you probably still want to be buying industrial before retail because there's still more growth. The flip side is retail is probably on its lowest ebb, so that's more of a growth, but there's more risk in it than there is in the industrial. Did that answer or that just confused the
No.
issue there?
It's what I was hoping to highlight by saying what I just said was that it's interesting to point out to the listeners because I would guess like myself, a lot of the listeners out there who are enjoying this podcast episode are just at the very beginning of their property journey and understanding in essence the mechanics of it, which is really what we've highlighted just then, that we need to not only be thinking about the rental yield and the safety of the tenant, but also understanding that certain sectors are hot, which are driven by certain narratives and certain tailwinds, which are also going to make for a good investment thesis or make for good consideration whenever it comes to understanding these sorts of decisions, and perhaps let somebody realize that it might be helpful to get somebody who lives and breathes this stuff on board so that they can get a real good idea of whether or not their money is in the right place. But Alasdair, I think we've done a really good job of summarising commercial property as an investment class today, and I wish to thank you for that. Alasdair, if anybody listening to this podcast wants to reach out to yourself off the back of anything that we said, how would they be best off finding you?
You can either phone me, so my telephone number is 07711006360. So happy to take a phone call or drop me an email. And my email address is just my name, which is Alasdair. So that's ALASDAIR .Irvine at Ingleshowie, which is INGLISHOWIE.com. Either way, you'll get me.